All right, so in this video, we're going to start working with animation, and specifically, I'm going to talk about working with keyframes on the time slider and in the channel box. And it's going to be really simple stuff. Just want to get a handle on how keyframes work. For this video, I'm using the Drone Racer 07.mac. It's the same Drone Racer model we've been working with. I just threw some shaders on here and organized all the objects into a group and gave them descriptive names. So before we get into animation, let's talk about setting up our workspace. So I'm using the Maya General workspace for this particular video. We can play with the animation workspace a little bit later on. First thing I want to do is make sure that I have the frame rate set correctly. So I'm going to use 24 frames per second, but you can change the frame rate using this pop-up menu right here. It's always a good idea to check with your director or your client. Make sure you've established the frame rate correctly from the very beginning. You can change it later, but it's less of a headache if you get it right from the beginning. The next thing I want to do is take a look at my animation and timeline settings. So I'm going to click on this little icon of this man being chased by a gear. And this will open up the preferences to the time slider settings. And I'm going to set my playback to playback every frame, one frame at a time, 24 frames times 1. So that means it's not going to go any faster than 24 frames per second. If I set this to free, then the playback might actually be faster than 24 frames per second. I'm not going to get a really accurate read on how fast my animation is. So I'll save that. So this button right here enables auto key. I like this setting because it basically means that if I have a channel keyframe on a particular object and at some other point on the timeline I make a change to that channel, like translate X or translate Y or whatever, it's going to automatically add a keyframe to reflect that change, which saves some button clicking. I like it. It's a nice setting. And I've set my playback to continuous loop, but you can use this button to cycle through the various different types of looping when you play the timeline. And then we want to set up our time slider. So right now the time slider range goes from frame 1 to frame 200. And then we have this little slider bar here, which we can drag back and forth to either zoom in on parts of the timeline. We can move this to look at other parts of the timeline, but it still goes from frame 1 to 200. And then you can numerically change the length of the time slider using these settings right here, or drag, whatever your preference is. A lot of animators like to start the timeline at frame 1000 or 1001 so that they have some room. If they need to add some stuff at the beginning or change some stuff at the beginning, they don't have to do something wacky like going in negative frames in the timeline. So you could do that by, let's say I wanted to make a 120 frame animation starting at frame 1000. Then I could type in, say, 1120 into this field and say 1000 into this field, and then drag out my little time slider. And you can see now it's going from frame 1000 to frame 1120. But I'm going to keep things simple and stick to going from frame 1 to frame, let's say, 120. So I'm mostly concerned with how to work with keyframes in Maya. This is not so much about best practices. I'm going to be setting keyframes directly on the groups and on the geometry, really just the propellers and the group. But in real life, what you'd want to do is set up a rig with some controls that animates the geometry indirectly. And that's a much better way to work. We can say that for a little bit later. Let's just focus on working with keyframes. And I'm just going to create a simple animation where the drone lifts off and flies forward, and then create animation for the propellers. So that's my main goal for this particular chapter. So let's start by animating the drone racer lifting off. So I'm going to go to frame 1. So you can just drag on the timeline here to set the frame. Go to frame 1. I'm going to select my group here and go to the channel box. So there's a few ways you can set a keyframe. If I just hit the S hotkey, you can see all of the fields in the channel box become red, indicating that there's a keyframe, and you can see there's also a keyframe here on the timeline. Now, it's keyframing everything. I don't necessarily want to do that because I don't think I'm going to be keyframing, say, the scale or that kind of thing. I really just want to worry about translation and rotation. So maybe setting a keyframe on everything is not a great idea. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. Another way to keyframe an individual channel, I can come up here, like let's say I wanted to set a keyframe on Translate Z. I can highlight this field, right click, and choose Key Selected. And you'll see now this is highlighted in red, and there's also a red marker on the timeline. If I move to a different part of the timeline, you can see that this turns to pink, indicating that there is a keyframe on this channel, but not on the current frame that we're on. So I'm going to undo that real quick. Another way to set a keyframe on the translate channels is Shift W. Shift W keyframes all 3 translation channels. It's just like the hotkey for the tool, right? If I wanted to rotate the object, I'd hit the E hotkey for the rotation tool. If I want to set a keyframe on the rotate channels, I could do Shift E. If I want a keyframe scale, I could do Shift R. So those are handy, but I'm going to undo that. So all I really care about at the moment is translate Y and Z. I only like to keyframe the channels that I know are going to be animated. It keeps things nice and clean and simple to work with. So I'm going to highlight Translate Y, and I'm going to shift click on Translate Z, right click over this and choose Key Selected. So now I have 2 keyframes, a 0 for Translate Y and Translate Z. So let's move to a later point in the timeline. Let's say frame 35. And I'm going to press the W hotkey to activate the Move tool, and I have Auto Key on. So I'm going to move this up. And you can see that automatically puts a keyframe on Translate Y, but not Translate Z, because I only moved in the Y direction. Now you can see as I scrub on the timeline, going up and down. If I hit the play button, you can see it's animating moving upwards. Let's say I want to change the length of that animation. Maybe it's a little bit too slow. I can hold the Shift key, click on the timeline, and you see how it becomes highlighted in red. I'm going to middle mouse button drag and drag this keyframe to frame 15. And now, of course, I have shorter space of time between those keyframes. I'm going to have it move forward just a little bit. So let's go to frame 15 and just drag a little bit on the Move tool to move it forward in Z. And you can see now there's a keyframe on both Y and Z on frame 15. So now it's moving up at an angle. Looks a little bit goofy moving up in that angle there, so maybe I want to go to sort of a middle range here somewhere, and let's move this just back in Z a little bit. Now I have it kind of moving up and then forward like that. Let's say I want to change the length of all 3 of these keyframes. I'm going to hold the Shift key and drag a selection over all 3 keyframes in the timeline. So while I have the keyframes selected on the timeline, I can use the arrows in the middle to drag them around and change their position, or I can use the arrows on either end to actually scale the range to increase or decrease the distance between keyframes. And you can see now I've changed the length of the overall animation. Now every once in a while you could end up with a keyframe that ends up on like a fraction of a frame, like 45.2 or something weird like that. You can force them to snap to whole numbers by selecting all the keyframes. So I'm holding the Shift key, dragging a selection, and then I'm going to right click over this, and I have a whole bunch of options here for the timeline. So one of them is snap. This is going to force the keyframes to snap to the closest whole number. I'm going to drag a selection over all of this and just move it maybe closer to the beginning, maybe so it starts on like frame 5 or something like that. Now you can see my animation, it's very robotic even by drone standards. We have essentially a straight line from this keyframe to this keyframe, and then a straight line from this keyframe to this keyframe, which gives the animation kind of a sharp angle as we change directions here. That's because my tangent type for these keyframes is set to linear. So we're going to get into working with different tangent types when we start talking about the graph editor in a later chapter in the series. But I did want to point out that if we go into the animation settings here, so I'm in the preferences. If I click on animation, you can see that in my version of Maya, the default in and out tangents are set to linear. So if you're seeing maybe a smoother animation or a stepped animation in your version of Maya, it might be because of the way these are set. So these are the default tangents. In other words, anytime I set a keyframe, it's going to say, okay, let's make it linear transition from one keyframe to the next, giving it that robotic motion. You can change this at any time, and you can also change the tangent type after the fact. So just because this is very robotic here in my version doesn't mean I can't change that later on. And like I said, we'll talk about that when we get into the graph editor. But for now, I want to continue talking about working with keyframes on the timeline, and specifically, let's talk about giving some rotation to the propellers. So I'm going to select this propeller here, and in the channel box, I'm going to go highlight rotate Y and choose key selected. And let's move a few frames later. Let's say, I don't know, frame 5 or something like that. And I'll type in 360. So it does an entire turn over the course of 5 frames, right? So then we get this. Pretty fast moving propeller. But of course, after that, it kind of stops. So the keyframes that I'm setting here, these are nodes. As I pointed out on volume 1, a node in Maya is just a packet of information. In this case, this node contains the information that for frame 1, we have Y rotation set to 0. Frame 5, it's 360. This keyframe node is a good example of a non-DAG node. So in volume 1, I talked about DAG objects only, this option. DAG stands for directed acyclic graph. It's a type of node that basically has a transform and a shape node. In other words, the propeller itself, go down here, right? We have transform node, we have shape node. And right now we keyframe the transform node. So a keyframe node itself, if I turn off DAG objects only and scroll down, we can see here are the keyframe nodes. So you can access them in the outliner if you really want to by turning off DAG objects only. But there's other ways to get to them. So I'm going to turn DAG objects only back on, keep my outliner nice and clean. Let's select that propeller, and I'm going to go into the attribute editor. And you can see it's also highlighted here in red in the attribute editor for the rotate channel. So this is X, Y, and Z. I'm going to right click over this and choose right rear propeller rotate Y output. That's the actual node that contains these keyframes. And you can see there's a little spreadsheet here. And the reason I want to get to this is because rather than having this rotate once and stop, I'd like it to continue rotating forever, but I don't necessarily want to have to keyframe that because that would be, well, kind of silly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the post infinity to cycle, which means it's just going to repeat over and over again forever. So I'll set that to cycle, and you can see now we have a nice rotation that continues forever, even when the drone is stopped in midair. So let's talk about how we can copy this animation to the other propellers. So one way to do this is to go back into the channel box, and I have my propeller selected, and I'm going to highlight it and right click and choose copy selected. And that's going to copy both keyframes. I'll select this propeller right here, go to frame 1, and I first need to set a keyframe on it so I can paste the keyframe information in there. So with rotate Y selected, I'm going to choose key selected. And then I'm going to choose paste selected, and you can see it's pasted both keyframes. But of course, after frame 5, it stops. So again, I'll go to the attribute editor and right click over this, choose left rear propeller output, and set post infinity to cycle. There we go. Let's take a look at another way we can copy the keyframes. I'm going to select this one. I'm going to hold the shift key, drag a selection over both keyframes, right click and choose copy. Select this propeller. Let's put a keyframe on rotate Y, key selected. Now if I drag a selection here, so hold the shift key, drag a selection and choose paste, it's going to paste those keyframes, but it's going to use a different range because I dragged out that selection. So let's undo that and go all the way back to frame 1. Make sure we have a keyframe on rotate Y, key selected. Actually, let's save ourselves a little trouble. Let's select both of these objects. So I have them both selected, and I'll choose key selected. And then, so hold shift, drag out 5 frames to select on the timeline. That pastes both keyframes, but it keeps also the spacing the same. There you go. Now all I need to do is select this, and let's go to the attribute editor. Let's go to this and set post infinity to cycle. It's actually easier to do this in the graph editor, but we'll get to that when we talk about the graph editor. And then we'll do post infinity for this one, cycle. And now we have, it's a lame animation, but it's effective. And in the process, we learned a few things about working with keyframes on the timeline and in the channel box. You can do quite a bit of animation just using the timeline in the channel box. But of course, if you really want to refine the animation and add some finesse to it, that's where the graph editor comes in. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter.